Great. Well, Pádraic, thanks a million for facilitating this interview. It's really appreciated, and I'm fully sure that the students are going to get an awful lot out of this because it's such an interesting, captivating concept. But it's also debated and can be contentious at times. So you've been working in this area for quite some time. So if you could, I would ask you to introduce yourself, and then we'll move forward with some questions.
Sure. My name is Pádraic Fogarty. I work as the campaigns officer for the Irish Wildlife Trust. The IWT is a environmental non-governmental organization, or an ENGO, and we've been around since 1979. So we've been working for a very long time, trying to highlight the importance of wildlife to people. That's really what our mission is. I'm an ecologist by trade. I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry. I've worked as a kind of a consultant environmentalist. But these days I seem to spend a lot of my time campaigning to change policies to address primarily our biodiversity emergency, which overlaps somewhat with the climate emergency. And I also wrote a book called Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature.
Great, great. Thanks very much. And it's a great book. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd highly recommend that everyone gets it. I'm going to order it for the library if the students are looking for it.
That's great.
Just for the students' benefit, how can they find out more about the Irish Wildlife Trust if they're interested in seeing what actually you do, just to get more on your background?
Well, I think for most people, social media is where they go to find out about anything these days. So we're pretty active on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and obviously we tweet and post an awful lot of stuff. And then we have our website is iwt.ie, where you'll find more in-depth material about our work. And also we do a lot of outreach in terms of talks and events, or at least we used to up to COVID. We're adapting to the new digital technology, so we are going forward with webinars and doing things online. So we're a small organization, but we're very active.
Fantastic, fantastic. And you have spent a lot of time writing and talking on the radio and in interviews about rewilding. So what do you think are the main reasons why rewilding should be considered as an approach in Ireland to nature conservation?
So I think maybe rewilding won't make any sense to you unless you fully appreciate how ecosystems have collapsed in Ireland and around Ireland. So I'm talking about the land and the sea. And the definition of a collapsed ecosystem is a complete transformation. So we don't have natural ecosystems in Ireland. We've about 120 species have gone extinct in Ireland since the arrival of people. We've utterly transformed natural spaces on Ireland and around it. So I think you have to try and get your head around that bit first, and then you have to then go, well, what can we do about it? And to me, rewilding is not the sum total of our solutions, but it is probably the most powerful and exciting tool we have at hand to address our collapsed ecosystems, or our biodiversity crisis, whatever you want to call it.
All right. So at the top, I suppose, then, could you describe roughly what rewilding entails in that sense?
So rewilding is, to me at least, it's about harnessing the power of nature to heal itself. Ecologists have been used to terms like conservation or even ecological restoration. But what's exciting about rewilding is that it acknowledges the fact that we often don't know very much about ecosystems and how ecosystems work. So rewilding doesn't necessarily have a very defined endpoint, whereas other forms of conservation have tended to be about, building a population of a particular species, for instance, or, having very set targets. Rewilding doesn't tend to have targets. Now, some people kind of interpret that as meaning you basically, walk away from an area and you do nothing. And that's not really what rewilding is about in an Irish context. It is because sometimes you have invasive species that need to be dealt with. Sometimes you have problems. We don't have an awful lot of the species that are needed to restore an ecosystem. So sometimes you have to actively restore these missing species. But ultimately, it's about getting to a point where the rewilded land or sea can basically look after itself. Sometimes it's called self-willed, so that you would hope that less and less human intervention is needed over time.
Very good. And are you aware of any rewilding initiatives currently underway in Ireland or being thought about in an Irish context?
The best example probably we have in Ireland is in Lochbora in County Offaly. Now, Lochbora used to be a worked out raised bog. Now, raised bogs don't really exist in Ireland anymore. There's a few tiny little scraps of them. But basically, in the 1980s, the bog had been totally mined out. And the workers there at the time had this idea to, well, what would happen if we just turned the pumps off? And if we just, move the machinery off and let nature take over. And if you go to Lochbora today, you will see, amazing wetlands and reeds and emerging birch forest and all these things. It wasn't planned to look like that. It was just what would happen if we did nothing and let nature take over. And it's been amazing, and it's been startling how nature has rebounded. Of course, nobody called it rewilding at the time. The word was not in popular usage, but effectively that's what it was.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned something there at the end, the interesting issue about calling something rewilding. And do you think that even the term rewilding has become somewhat problematic for some sectors of society, or do you think it's a good term to use?
I think it's a great term to use, but I acknowledge that it can be controversial. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing. We are at a very dangerous point in human history at the moment, because our entire global ecosystem is reaching a tipping point, not only due to biodiversity collapse, but also climate change, of course, and pollution and these other pressures. So in many ways, we have to be quite confrontational about what needs to happen or what needs to be done. So I'm not really worried that it does cause debate and some controversy. I think that's quite a welcome thing. If you use a word, for instance, like restoration, and there's no reaction and people just shrug their shoulders, well then we're not really dealing with the big problem then. So to me, rewilding is important because it's exciting, because it has gone beyond the realms of academia. It is in common usage. People have ideas about what rewilding is, and those ideas can be different. That's not a problem either. The fact that it gets people talking and gets people engaged with the natural world, to me, that is the really exciting thing about it. So definitely stick with the word.
Great. And in your opinion then, what might rewilding involve in an Irish context?
So a lot of the elements of rewilding are already accepted practice. So, I mean, if you were talking about bringing back extinct species in Ireland, that's already acknowledged as as something that can be done. And even with big predators, we have brought back large predators to Ireland since the 1990s. We brought back golden eagles and white-tailed eagles to Ireland with varying degrees of success. Obviously, we'd love to see wolves come back, wild boar, who knows, possibly even bears were once a species in Ireland, lynx, but also, the many dozens of plants and insects and birds that maybe not be so familiar. We need to be bringing them all back, and we need to be trying to reassemble the ecosystem in a way. Of course, that is only one aspect of it. We also need to have areas of land and sea which are pretty much left to nature, at least dominated by nature, might be the best way of describing it. Again, I mean, I would emphasize that this is not, I'm not advocating rewilding all of Ireland. Some people feel that what I'm trying to do is get rid of agriculture, or it's somehow anti-farming. It's not. We need farming, and farming is culturally as well as an economically important land use, and we can have high nature value farming. But we should also acknowledge that not everywhere is suitable for farming. At the moment in Ireland, we have sheep on the tops of mountains. We have sheep on islands in the Atlantic Ocean. We have farm animals where there shouldn't be farm animals. And that leads to other social and environmental problems. But if we were to look at the land available for rewilding, I'm thinking about the bogs that have been worked out by Bord na Móna. I'm thinking about our hilltops. And then I'm thinking about the vast areas of ocean around us that really need to be rewilded.
And given that rewilding is about re-establishing lost ecosystems, essentially, and ecosystems are so complex, where would you actually start? What interventions would you start with in order to bring about a rewilded part of the country?
I think the starting point is always space, the two-dimensional space. And this is what I love about rewilding, because a lot of us have some control over a two-dimensional space. Maybe it's in your garden, and you might decide, okay, well, that space, I'm not going to mow it. I'm not going to plow it. I'm not going to put farm animals on it. And that I think that's where we start. Obviously, then you can get into discussions about invasive species and blocking drains and reintroductions and so on. And that depends on the scale of space that we're talking about. I think for a lot of the ocean, really it's just about creating space for nature. You don't have to do an awful lot. Just get the very big boats out that do all the damage. On land, it can be a little bit more complicated, but I have tried rewilding at home in my garden, and I can testify that even on very small spaces, it's remarkable what can happen and what can spring out of the ground just when you decide to make that space and step back a little bit.
And in that sense, it probably segues into an interesting question. Do you think, when we think about rewilding, we usually associate it with, you talked about earlier on, sheep on mountaintops or the sea. Do you think there's a place for urban rewilding?
Oh, very much so. And I think when you look at our urban spaces, we've always associated our cities as being kind of the opposite of nature. Nature is something that's in the countryside. Cities are where people live, and we have our buildings and where important business is done. But if we ask ourselves, can cities and our towns, can they contribute to important ecological processes? Can they help to clean water? Can they help to store carbon? Can they provide habitat for species? I think the answer to all those questions is yes. Frequently, of course, space is the big thing in our cities. Space is in high demand. But if you look at our cities on Google Earth, you'll see an awful lot of our space is given over to cars. An awful lot of our space is given over to vast areas of very shortly mowed grass. And anybody who lives near a green space will be familiar with just these acres and acres of grass that people drive over with mowing machines every couple of weeks. And that's keeping the nature from recolonizing these spaces. So we see that it should be a very easy thing to do. We've already got soil. I mean, soil is the foundation for all nature on land. I've seen in Paris, and I've seen in Dublin even, where concrete is being removed, it's being dug up to reveal the soil. And then you've got your substrate for rewilding. And then, of course, don't forget, a lot of our cities in Ireland are coastal or river cities, and of course, huge opportunity to rewild oceans and reconnect us, to remind us that we're island people, and we're coastal and maritime people as well.
Fantastic. So there's hope for all environments, and it's really interesting. What barriers then do you think there are to rewilding in an Irish context? We talked about briefly perceptions, but there's probably more barriers than just that, I suspect.
Well, I mean, obviously there's policy and maybe scientific barriers, but I think the fundamental one is psychological. And I think maybe this is why the word rewilding is provoking to some people, because it challenges our place in nature. And I mean, the story of humanity, at least since the Bible, has been one about dominating nature and humans' supremacy over all the other living creatures on Earth. And rewilding challenges that. to say that, humans are not, superior beings. Other animals have a right to exist. If we talk about bringing wolves back to Ireland, a lot of people get very excited about that, in a positive and a negative way. But in many ways, the wolf was assuredly an Irish animal, as the curlew or the corncrake, and has a right to return to Ireland as much as the golden eagle did. And so, it does challenge our relationship with nature. So that's why I think definitely the barrier to rewilding frequently is in our head. But of course, it is the policy issue as well. And there are certain policy issues that we need to get in place to promote rewilding and to see it as a good thing.
If I'm sure you've had this question put to you on several occasions, but if you're talking about large carnivores such as a wolf, the argument I always hear is that, well, the entire countryside has changed since we had wolves in the country. They're no longer suitable. Even, yes, they may have been here in the past, but the environmental envelope is now altered to such a degree that we can no longer sustain them. How would you respond to a question such as that?
Well, there's a couple of aspects to it. I mean, we had wolves right up until the 1700s. Now, Ireland was a much more rural country for much of that period. So certainly there were people living alongside wolves in rural Ireland for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, people will say as well, right, we don't have the forest in Ireland, and that's right. I mean, our native woodlands are less than 2%. They've practically been extinguished. But we could get our forest back. Plus, wolves are not necessarily forest animals. They're very, very adaptable. There are wolves now in Holland and in Belgium, which have also been, completely altered ecologically. So the physical space for wolves is there. They're very adaptable creatures. All we have to do is not poison them and not shoot them, and they'll do just fine. And that maybe comes back to the point I was making about rewilding being more of a psychological barrier than any kind of a policy or an ecological barrier. Of course, there are species that we'd like to get back that would present greater ecological problems. I'm thinking of the capercaillie. Capercaillie is an enormous grouse that lived in Ireland up to the 1700s, and it'd be a wonderful bird to bring back. And it doesn't kill sheep, or people probably wouldn't find it threatening, but it does need forest habitat, and there's no point in trying to bring it back until that forest habitat is there. But the advantage of wolves is that they're really adaptable creatures. They would in many ways create the habitat for all the other wildlife that we have around us.
Indeed, and they have capercaillie, of course, in Scotland, don't they? So they're doing.
They do, and they have osprey in Scotland, and they have wildcats in Scotland, which were also creatures that lived in Ireland that are gone extinct. And Scotland has a little bit more native woodland than us, but really not very much. So a lot of these creatures are really just hanging on in Scotland as well.
Great. Do you think the rewilding approach could be used, or what relationship do you think it has with helping Ireland to meet its commitments, international commitments there, nature conservation, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the EU Biodiversity Strategy, the new one, as well potentially as our own National Biodiversity Action Plan?
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities at the moment. I mean, if you take climate change, number one, meeting our climate change targets rely on taking carbon out of the air. Even if we stopped burning fossil fuels in the morning, we still need to take carbon dioxide out of the air. And of course, the best carbon capture and storage technology we know is in nature. It's in trees, and it's in soil, and it's in kelp forests and ocean sediments. So rewilding can really help get that process moving. For instance, if we decided we wanted to recreate large areas of native woodland, which is better? Should we go out with our shovels and our plastic tubes and our saplings and plant trees, millions and millions of trees? Or should we just let the trees plant themselves? Trees have been planting themselves for hundreds of millions of years and are way better at it than we are. Rewilding recognizes that. Yes, they might be crooked trees. Yes, they might, fall over and so on. But that's how nature works. So rewilding definitely can help us do that. And even with restoring the bogs, the worked out bogs. We're never going to get our raised bogs back in these areas because the topography has changed too much. But rewilding, just letting the water flood, letting the habitats develop around those wet areas. Maybe you'll get peat growth in some areas, maybe you'll get forest growing in other areas. Basically letting nature decide what is the best vegetation in any particular circumstance. So that's how rewilding can definitely help us.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, and there seems to be lots of reasons. So it's multifaceted potentially as a solution to many problems. Do you think the National Parks and Wildlife Service is receptive to the issue of rewilding, or do you think they might have different understandings of where it sits in nature conservation?
So, I mean, there's two things there. I mean, ecologists in general sometimes find rewilding challenging because it is very different to how we have done conservation up to now. The last 30 years, we have spent drawing lines on maps, for this is going to be a nature reserve, this is going to be a special area of conservation, and we're going to come up with targets for what we want in this space. Rewilding does away with all of that, and that can be challenging. And of course, bringing back large predators, for instance, is challenging to a lot of ecologists. A lot of people say to me, why on earth would we bring back wolves when so many of our bees and birds and so on are going extinct? So that is a challenge to many ecologists. The other thing, of course, you mentioned the National Parks and Wildlife Service is it's not really an agency or a body that is capable at the moment for dealing with our biodiversity crisis or the ecological problems that we face. So we definitely, we've got a new government, we've got a program for government, we've got a budget now coming up next week. One of my top priority is getting a new nature conservation agency for Ireland that can provide us with the science, that can manage the reintroduction of missing species, that can enable local communities to create their own nature reserves. We really need to do conservation differently, and we need a state agency that is fit to do that for us.
Fascinating. And we have these new regional assemblies also that have come in. So we're talking about the national, at the national level, we're talking about the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But if we're looking at coordinating policy of land, planning policy, there's the national level, there's a regional level, and there's a local level. With these regional assemblies, I don't know, they're still kind of finding their feet. Do you think there's a role for them in rewilding?
I certainly think there's a role that we have missed for local participation in nature conservation. That might be rewilding, that might be, high nature value farming or forestry, for instance. But definitely we have examples in Ireland where the local community has been given the right tools and the right support. They really have come up with amazing results. We have a lot of public land in Ireland from forestry and Bord na Móna, Cuilch and so on. I'd love to see that land be leased or rented at a peppercorn rent to the local community to create nature reserves that are led by the local community, managed and monitored by the local community with the support of science and with government backing. And you mentioned the EU biodiversity strategy, which calls for a doubling of our protected area network. I mean, how are we going to do that? I think the way to do that is to let local people get on with it and decide where the best place for a nature reserve is in their local area.
Well, that's interesting, because if you think of those local ideas, or the local mobilization of local knowledge and local interest, and we're also talking about rewilding, what role do you think there are for city and county councils through their plans and their strategies for these kind of approaches?
Yeah, I mean, the local authorities, zone lands, so a lot of the time they're deciding what is the best use for any particular area of land. I would love to see rewilding become a mainstream tool. As I say, it is a tool, it's not the only one, but in Ireland currently, local authorities don't have the power to designate areas for nature. We see terms like high amenity value sometimes used in zonings. We don't see zonings for rewilding or for nature reserves or so on. We see that in other jurisdictions in the UK, for instance, local authorities can designate nature reserves. So you could imagine a local community trying to save their local forest that maybe doesn't have any formal designation, that the local community could gather the evidence to present to the local authority to say, we would like this area rewilded. And we'll do the monitoring, but we need your support to designate it and make sure it's not going to be zoned for housing or something like that in the future. And to see it as, you know, you mentioned green infrastructure, nature as being essential infrastructure for carbon storage, for water protection. So there's something in it for the local authority as well as the local people. So definitely, we'd love to see that in land use plans.
Great. And can you think of any international best practice examples that we can learn from here in Ireland?
I think certainly we need to look to Europe. Europe has a very unique land use history. So, you know, people get very excited about Yellowstone National Park, for instance, in America, which is a really exciting story, and I love the story. But, you know, the conservation model in America, which talks a lot about wilderness, is not necessarily applicable to Ireland. I find I have a big problem with the word wilderness, which I think rewilding can avoid. But if you're looking for examples in Europe, there's an area in Scotland called Glenfeshie, which I visited last summer. And in Glenfeshie, basically, they removed all the deer, and the forest is coming back. The forest is just re-emerging from the ground. It's an amazing thing to see. We also see rewilding examples. There's a group called Rewilding Europe that has a number of projects across the continent, from Portugal to Romania, where they are facilitating the return of large animals, vultures and bison, for instance, and working with local communities. And the key to these is that these rewilding, we call them rewilding projects. Actually, they don't like calling it a project because they feel that it is a very long-term commitment to an area that could go on for decades and decades. And I think that's really the timescale that we need to be thinking of. So for sure, there's lots of places in Europe where we can learn.
Great. Well, that's been a fantastic interview, really beneficial to everyone. So I must thank you sincerely for that, for facilitating this. Really great.
Not at all.